Guy Opperman, Conservative MP since 2010. We're going to start this interview by talking about a tough period in your life, a tough period for you and your wife, Flora, who gave birth to Teddy and Rafe. You lose them both in 2020. Can you tell me what happened after Flora had given birth?
Well, it was a very long week in St Thomas's Hospital, and we chose St Thomas's so I could do it because it's right next to the House of Commons, and her birth was quite complicated, her pregnancy was quite complicated. It was a very long week where we tried to keep the boys alive, and one came and went rather quickly, and then we spent 4 or 5 days trying to keep the second child alive, and sadly that didn't happen, and so we spent a long week in the hospital, and I couldn't really be there beforehand because of COVID, and I wasn't able to attend any maternity appointments whatsoever. And as a consequence of that, I felt sort of that I was not as engaged or as helpful, and you go through the process of, could I have done anything more to help her or them to survive? And you come to terms with that over a period of time.
Do you think the expectations on men going through such a traumatic process are different to the expectations placed on mums?
Well, I think mums, that we're on a journey, aren't we? So 20 years ago, even 10 years ago, people lost children, and it was a very matter of fact, these things happen, move on, don't worry, you'll have further children. Whereas everybody now accepts, I hope, that there is great trauma for the woman in particular, for obvious reasons, but the parents, the father, the partner goes through just as much trauma and sadness, and it's the inability to do anything about it, because men are great we're trying to solve problems and fix stuff, and it's that incapacity to do anything is very, very frustrating and very saddening, and you have to come to terms with that. But listen, we've all been on a journey. It is way, way better as a society, as a health service, and as an acceptance between adults of the trauma of baby loss than it ever was before.
Do you think there are any public policy changes that could have made such a terrible experience any easier? Have we come far enough as a society?
So there's an awful lot that many of us are doing to campaign on this. So as part of Baby Loss Awareness Week and a variety of charities and campaigns that are being run by some esteemed charities, I think there's a few things. The first would be a sort of uniformity of care throughout the country. So if you have a traumatic incident and lose a child in X trust, you can be treated very differently in Y trust. And that's not necessarily because they're worse or that they are better. It's because there just isn't really the standard practice. There isn't the degree of teaching and learning across different trusts. There isn't the specializations that we probably need to have. You need to go forward down the route that people did with stroke and various other health policies in the past. And there are certain key things. So if you have a baby under 24 weeks, you can't validate its existence. You can't have a birth certificate or a death certificate. It's extraordinarily difficult. This certification of life or death, particularly when they're stillborn, is very, very hard. And I've talked about it in the House of Commons recently in the debate during Baby Loss Awareness Week. And that sort of stuff needs to change and is in the process, I believe, of being changed.
Did you feel any pressure to go back to work sooner than you were ready?
So I was a government minister at the time. I was taking forward 2 pieces of legislation, one of which was in relation to the triple lock. And no one else could do the legislation. And I took a week off and the House was sitting at that time, when the boys got sick and then died. And then I went back to work, slowly but surely. I think it's a very difficult job to say you're not going to go back to work. For you've done this job just as much as I have, and you kind of have to crack on with it. I had a lot of support from colleagues, but also you just need to get on with it to a certain degree. Now, I'm quite a robust character in that respect. I know that my wife would never have been able to go back to work that quickly, and many other couples would have really, really struggled. So there is a great deal of pressure in an employment situation that needs to be understood. And there is a bill going through the House of Commons in the private members bill that I very much support, which has, when you have a neonatal loss, that there is a degree of time off. Certainly, the next day I was utterly useless as a minister, as a member of parliament.
Will the government support those measures?
I think they are. It's still, I think, in a process, as you know, with PMBs, it's in a process of negotiation, but I believe they are, yes.
Did you seek counselling? Did you have to take any medication? Those are personal questions and you don't have to answer them if you don't.
No, it's fine. I didn't take any medication. We had a little bit of counselling. The main thing, we counselled each other. I think you really understand your marriage. You really understand a relationship. You try and be as kind as you possibly can to your partner, but also yourself. And being kind to yourself is probably the most important thing. And it is so easy to get into a circle of blaming yourself or blaming circumstances or seeking to blame others. And, you know, bad things happen to good people. This is not it's not a fair world.
Do you mark their birthdays in?
Oh yeah, absolutely, yes. Very much so. I mean, it's a birth fest because obviously it was over a week-long period, and we are very much celebrate and remember them. And it helped. We bought a very adorable fox red Labrador to basically take our mind off it. Went straight out and bought a Labrador. We talked about it for ages. I bought a Labrador who was the most spoilt dog in the world. And so the kind of her gotcha day is pretty much their birthday. And yes, you don't forget this. It stays. I've met mums, because I'm now a big campaigner on this, I've met mums and dads who 30, 40 years on are still traumatized and remembering and commemorating the loss of their child. Some whom didn't get over the line because, you know, the miracle is that, so Flora could not give birth in a normal way, had to have IVF. Now IVF is a miracle thing, but I've met parents who are 30 to 40 years old, they're older than I am, who had one shot and couldn't do it again for obvious reasons. Yes. And that is very, very difficult for them. Obviously, if you can move on, try and have further children, try and build your life, then life gets a lot easier. But you don't ever forget the experience. And, you know, I always say that I have had 3 children. I've just had one take-home child.
And you have Christopher now.
I do indeed.
4 months ago, Christopher was born. Joyful. It must be particularly joyful. I wonder if...
And exhausting.
And exhausting.
I've got bags under the eyes. I look terrible. I wish I had a ton of makeup. They don't have any makeup yet.
Oh, I've got enough for both of us on.
Okay, all right.
When you have lost 2 children, do you feel anxiety about your take-home child? Or do you just feel it?
Yes, I think any parent is struck by how remarkably fragile their child is. And you suddenly realise that awful burden of responsibility in a way that is way more than you ever thought it would be. I think clearly you worry that this may be your only shot at this, but also slightly when you've been through the trauma that we've been, it actually makes parenting easier because slightly you don't sweat the small stuff.
Yeah.
And I try and live my life, particularly since 2011 when I had a brain tumour, not worrying about things that are clearly aggravating, upsetting, or, you know, I had a particular incident where I was meant to be giving, and you'll know this, I was meant to be giving a speech on Saturday night in my constituency, and I was wearing a nice jacket and a nice pair of trousers and a nice pair of shoes, and I held said child and he vomited all over me.
You mentioned that you'd had a brain tumour.
Yeah, I've had all the injuries. I broke 22 bones as a jockey, and when I was a lot thinner. And I've got a reconstructed shoulder, I've got a splenectomy scar here because my spleen was taken out after a fall at Stratford. And then I was doing the budget in 2011, and I often say the budget nearly killed me. And I collapsed in central lobby, and I had a brain tumour the size of about your fist, so a lady's fist, on the sort of back left of my head, and a nice surgeon called Neil Kitchen took it out with basically a small chainsaw. Though if you're about to have your lunch, apologies. Basically, they cut your skull open with a chainsaw, basically, and kind of lift that open. Take a smaller chainsaw, cut out the tumour, and then literally staple you back together. After, by the way, after an operation where they open your femoral artery, pop a line up through your aorta, and because the worry is you're going to bleed to death, because it's quite tricky when you bleed in your head. So they use a soldering iron, basically. They have a posh word for it, but it's a soldering iron, and they singe the base of the tumour before they chop it out. Sorry about that, but so I'm not very keen on chainsaws anymore, and saws generally. I wouldn't be very good on anything where I had to be like a forester.
Goodness me. Whew. That's awakened all of our senses in a very graphic way. Thank goodness you're all right.
Well, listen, when you have a cancer, you just want to cut out. You know, so they give you the consenting chat. So if you're being consented in a hospital, they have to say, look, we're going to give you a general anaesthetic. We're going to be obviously putting a chainsaw to your head, which is not exactly the most simplest of procedures, and you could bleed out, and we could basically cut your. You could lose your sight, speech.
Gosh.
Right side is particularly the likely thing you'd lose. And they give you a percentage on all this, and I'm adding it up, and it goes, well, there's 1% for this, and 1% for that, and 3% for that. Came back 8%, something disastrous would happen. But obviously, if you don't have the cancer cut out, you die in 6 months. So it's a no-brainer. You just crack on. And hope his chainsaw hand is good.
We all do.
Yeah.
A final question. And I guess mums who are members of Parliament get asked this a lot, but perhaps not dads. So I want to ask you, as a new dad with a 4-month-old child, is Parliament and its working practices family friendly? I
think they try to be, but they've got a long way to go. It is not a family friendly job per se, and it's the House of Commons, the building itself, is definitely not family friendly. It is very, very tough to have a baby in the House of Commons. Now, several mums and several dads, and I'm having to do it from time to time, are trying to do that. It's not easy. And I think that explains sometimes why some people just go, look, at the work-life balance is too complicated. You're seeing several mums, for example, beginning to think about, am I going to continue and stay and do this very tough job in circumstances where, you've done this job. It's a 60-hour-a-week job. It's very tough to bring up children, be in 2 places at once, and also manage childcare and children in circumstances where you're trying to be as good as an MP as you want to be, but also you're trying to be as good a parent as you want to be. Now, lots of people have those problems, but there's no doubt that doing that in the public eye is very complicated.
If there was one change that could be made to how Parliament works?
I think it's more back office support for those parents who have children, so that in reality it works better for them, and possibly some sort of parental pairing. That would be, but the whips are trying to work on that, to be honest. But then you get to tight votes, then things get complicated. You know that as well as I do.
Really, real pleasure to chat to you. Thank you for your openness.
My pleasure.
And good luck with the effects of the chainsaw, but more importantly with 4-month-old Christopher.
Yeah, the chainsaw doesn't matter, the 4-month-old does.